Hello, everyone. I'm Kim Mack. Welcome to the 11th event in the spring 2024 iteration of the Popular Music Books in Process series, a collaboration between the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the POP Conference. Thank you to my co-organizers, Francesca Royster, Antonia Randolph, Gus Stadler, Carl Wilson, and from a distance, Eric Weisbard. On April 29th, James Spooner and Chris Altieri will be in conversation with contributor Joanna Davis McElligott to talk about their new collection, Black Punk Now, published by Soft Skull Press. You can find the full schedule on the IASPM US website under the Journal tab, and previous recorded sessions of the Popular Music Books in Process series are archived on Eric's YouTube channel. Today, we're very excited to have Michael Gallope in conversation with Elliott H. Powell to discuss Michael's recent book, The Musician as Philosopher, New York's Vernacular Avant-Garde, 1958 to 1978. Michael Gallope is Associate Professor of Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature at the University of Minnesota, where he is affiliate faculty in the School of Music, Department of American Studies, Program in Religious Studies, and the Program in Moving Image, Media, and Sound. He is the author of Deep Refrains, Music, Philosophy, and the Ineffable, that was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2017, and The Musician as Philosopher, New York's Vernacular Avant-Garde, 1958 to 1978, that was just recently published, also by the University of Chicago Press. As a musician, he has worked in a variety of genres that span a range of experimental music, rock, and electronic dance music. In Minneapolis, he performs with the minimal ambient band E. Elliott H. Powell is Associate Professor of American Studies and Asian American Studies at the University of Minnesota. His work sits at the intersections of race, sexuality, and popular music. He is the author of Sounds from the Other Side, Afro-South Asian Collaborations in Black Popular Music, published by University of Minnesota Press in 2020, which received the Woody Guthrie Book Award from the International Association for the Study of Popular Music U.S. branch, as well as the American Musicological Society's Philip Brent Book Award. After the discussion, there'll be a Q&A, which Antonia Randolph will moderate. Please put your questions and comments in the chat as they come to you, and Antonia will find them there at the end of the discussion. And feel free to also post comments throughout the conversation. So now I will turn things over to Michael and Elliott.
Thank you so much, Kim. Yeah. So I was going to say that Mike and I kind of talked a little bit about how we wanted to start things off. And so as a way to kind of set things up is one, to congratulate you, Mike, on a fantastic book right here, of course, going to do the plug. But if you can give us a bit of context to the book, how it kind of came into being, and like I said, share a little bit more about the context around the book, the central kind of arguments, those sets of things.
Yeah, thanks, Elliott. And Kim, thank you so much for the introduction and for hosting this. And it's a privilege to be able to do this. I mean, I think I speak for anyone who's writing academic work and sitting by yourself in a room for years, and then, hungry for different opportunities to be able to sort of create dialogue. And Elliott and I talk a lot about all kinds of things related to music and our work at the University of Minnesota. And sometimes it's nice to just have an occasion to do that and sort of think aloud, and different kinds of things come out in this context. So I just want to say I really appreciate it, and I'm excited to have this conversation. And I think Elliott also was an influence on my project. I mean, first of all, he's abundantly footnoted, but he helped me out, with some panicked phone calls when I was sort of confused and perplexed by a situation. And so I appreciate it. It's part of a longer term discussion we've had. And so thanks for having us. So I guess this book, I had started out, I was deeply interested in how philosophers wrote about music for a number of years. And I wrote a book called Deep Refrains that was about how European philosophers associated with critical theory and a bit outside of critical theory, sort of continental philosophy, were writing about music in ways that really noted that music was distinct among all the arts. And one of the sort of theories that was forwarded among these philosophers was its non-linguistic capacities and the way it had a certain power of sensation and a certain inconsistency. And it was like a magnet for problems that we couldn't solve with language, and a magnet for problems that were, social difficulties or utopian desires and other kinds of things that also seemed to be ineffable. And it was a long project that, evolved over time, but it came to me that I was actually really interested in the term ineffability and rescuing it from being unfashionable and very conservative, and instead thinking about ineffability as utopian and as filled with possibility and as generative, and maybe not totally separate from language, but sort of always at a bit of a remove from linguistic clarity. And if you're a philosopher, when things are not linguistically clear and social problems are really difficult, music can be an inspirational force. It can sort of guide you in thinking about things that resist solutions. And so that was guiding my work for a long time. And there was a moment, Suzanne Cusick, who was on my dissertation committee and who was a big influence on my thought, responded to my dissertation and was just like, who's doing the thinking? How does this really scale down to musical praxis? And can we translate all these philosophical ideas to something that, is more readily accessible as, a musical situation? And that was one influence. And another one was that I just started spending a lot more time playing and performing. And it was in my performances, particularly, I worked with this Sierra Leonean collaborator, Janka Nabe, for 7, 8 years. And his perspective on music was so completely different from what I had experienced in my life growing up. And we collaborated all the time. We debated the politics of music. We talked about, the metaphysical meanings of music and whether things were utopian or not, and what it meant to have capitalism compromising your creative process. And I don't think anyone or any text challenged me as much as that situation had challenged me in terms of how I thought about what music was among all the arts in terms of its politics and its aesthetics and anything. I think it sort of slowed me down a lot. And I think it guided me to this second project in a way, which is to sort of do the opposite of the first book. If the first book is all about philosophers explaining the music, I wanted to figure out, like, is there a way of thinking about musical practice itself as being philosophical? Like, how do utopian desires really sort of congeal in decisions that musicians make? And how are sort of social conflicts, particularly around questions of race and gender in the 1960s, which are so central to the rise of the New Left and a rise of new social movements and anti-caste struggles, like all of these big political and social movements, how are they sort of thinking through music in their desires, in their fantasies, in their utopian yearnings, and in their, sometimes, incommensurable standpoints, right? And so I think then it became, thinking about the book and wanting to work across these various genres, it became about this historical question too, about the 1960s and about how a few genres that were interested in really dissonant avant-garde music could be trying to think about social issues, to fantasize about them, to speculate about them, to think about spirituality as social because of music or through music. All these kind of complicated mixtures of thinking and music and sound and social struggle that just fascinated me as a problem. So it became a way of trying to sort of think about how philosophy is still of concern for music at all, and to try to join that with a serious question about history and social history and how race and gender live in the social history of music. And I guess finally is the question of, like, how music itself causes social change, how figures like, Bob Dylan or Odetta or Miles Davis are part of social history, right? Through their sonic decisions and through the kind of, contested lives that they struggled through. And it reminds me, this is a moment of the 1960s that this is when the culture industry is created. These are the 2 decades. This is where all these genres are invented, right? This is when the record industry, the scale of it, the scope of it, the amount of attention on it, just because of technology and media, expands to a completely new set of proportions. And so the fact that that's happening at the same time that these new social desires are emerging, particularly in, the US publics of various sorts, like, I'm not trying to totalize the publics because there are a multitude of perspectives and publics at this time, but the media and the technology do open up new spheres, new public spheres of thinking through sound. So that is, that is what I was hoping to accomplish with this book. I also, I think there's a political issue that we've been dealing with I'm in a cultural studies and comparative literature department, which is super interdisciplinary, but also, my background is in musicology. How do you expand what counts as philosophy? How do you expand what counts as music? How do you come up with tools for dealing with these liquid forms that have so many kinds of things going on inside the recordings, right? And it's kind of difficult to analyze. And I think, as scholars looking back on the 1960s, I think we've still barely really understood that decade. It's so incredibly complex. And I also wanted to try to develop a kind of framework that would, create pathways, I think, for asking certain kinds of questions about this period of time and about the musicians involved, even if they're uncomfortable and they don't make any sense some of the times. And a lot of times they don't make sense. And I think for some reason that's part of the point, right? So yeah, that's a sort of general, I think, picture, if that's helpful in establishing like what I was hoping to accomplish.
Yeah, no, it totally does. And I think one of the sort of last points that you kind of raised, and I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more, is really about this kind of collection, or this kind of collection of sets of musicians that are at the heart of this book, right? So as you already mentioned, right, this period of the 1960s, or the long 1960s, but then you're focused a lot around downtown kind of New York scene, but you also gather this wide range of sets of musicians. And I'm curious if you can talk to us a little bit more about why you chose these particular sets of musicians, why you wanted to kind of place them in conversation. So those are those are the 2 parts. And the third one is to go back to something that you actually mentioned in the book, is that you make a deliberate move to refer to them as musicians and not composers. So what was that kind of reasoning behind that as well?
Yeah. Well, let me take the musician composer question first, and then go back to the other one about the selection of these various figures. So I think the word composer, it has so much weight. I think it has a very racialized weight. It has a lot of institutional weight. When Ornette Coleman is really unhappy about his career in the mid-1960s, he just puts his finger right on it. And he's like, I'm in the New York Times, I'm in Downbeat, I'm given all this prestige. I can't win a grant. He's like, I have to work in the clubs and circumstances which he considered to be, unpleasant, brutal, poorly compensated, which is all, he's correct about all of those things. What qualifies as composition or what does not was, I think, a gatekeeping. It's a technique of listening. It has to do with power and authority and processing music as a certain form of knowledge, and authoritative knowledge. And I think, so going back to the political question of what counts as music, for me, it was important to pick this term musician, which is not to say that Ornette Coleman or Alice Coltrane, or, for that matter, any of the members of the Velvet Underground were not composers. I mean, certainly they wrote music. I mean, Coleman wrote Skies of America, which is an important orchestral piece. He's was writing notation all the time, right? And composed his own melodies and crafted the kind of forms that he's involved with. But what he did as a creator really resisted that category. I mean, I think that there's just too much excess, too much complexity, too much thinking that he's doing at the level of social interaction, at the level of improvisation, about recognizing the grammar of his various collaborators and working with varied styles, the kind of collisions and layers of something like the primetime era, that just really exceed that category. And so I think for me, the term musician is an attempt to sort of move beyond that academic distinction between composer and performer. And it's not only academic. I mean, there's other versions of it as well, but to try to think in a broader category of people who were widely respected during the 1960s as being innovators of the avant-garde, but did not fit that category. And exceeded it. In terms of the selection of them, well, yeah, I mean, a version of this book, like I was just thinking about your chapter on Miles Davis, and certainly he's kind of an avant-garde figure, but not really in the way that Ornette Coleman was. I mean, and he, of course, like you write about the 1970s period, which is a period where his sort of popularity rose and he sort of stylistically opened up an entirely new genre of music, right? I think that there's something about, when you're trying to work across all these different boundaries, what do you find as a sort of coherent thread? And there's something about the avant-garde, particularly this idea of a dissonance that shocks you. When you look at the reviews of all these different genres of music, it could be a Cage concert and David Tudor, or a Fluxus show, or it could be, Ornette Coleman at the 5 Spot. It could be Alice Coltrane and John Coltrane at Town Hall, the Titans of the tenor saxophone, I think 1966 maybe. It could be the Velvet Underground and Andy Warhol, the Exploding Plastic Inevitable. But you'll see recurring responses in the press. This is nihilism. This is psychosis. These people have lost their minds. Or my favorite is the psychiatrists are going to make a lot of money now because of this music. That there's this sense that this music is yearning to address a crisis of the 1960s that is quite indeterminate and quite open-ended. And so I do think, even though it's pretty difficult to sort of collapse any differences between these various genres, I always love the sort of challenge and the provocation of nonetheless persisting and trying to see and hear continuities across, traditionally separate genres of avant-garde classical music and jazz and rock music. And in the sort of provocation of dissonance in the issue of I think, trying to sort of dissolve the self in a sort of political way, or play with the coordinates of the self. You're elevating the self and you're dissolving it. There are certain philosophical issues that recur. And so I think there was an element of wanting to try to think about the period in a way, again, it cannot be comprehensive, right? But there's enough where you could sort of start to think about tendencies in the changes of musical experimentation, tendencies in the social imagination that allow us to think about the 60s in a different way, and allow us to think about changes in music in a different way. And I think I guess one way to think about this is that a lot of the way this period has been written about is that the sort of creative music and jazz traditions that are associated with Afro-modernism, Amiri Baraka is the intellectual that's often associated with that world, right? He's the philosopher who was both obviously an important critic of the time, but created a sort of large framework in blues people for thinking about what that Afro-modernism meant. And Adorno is famously, and Cage as well, are famously racialized in their thinking about jazz, about avant-garde music. And so for me, it was like, can we kind of create an uncomfortable collision and counterpoint between these difficult standpoints that are not commensurable, really? But there are parallels, right? There are parallels, the question of social history, of alienation, and of dealing with race. And can these be sort of clarified, right? Because I don't think that one could write about the 60s and the philosophy of these various musicians without sort of elevating and recognizing how complex those tensions are. So that's, yeah, I know that's a lot, but that's it's a complex question.
No, and I listen, it's amazing. I think how you've been able, like I said, I love the kind of phrase that you sort of mentioned about a kind of uncomfortable, sort of collision and counterpoint. I think is a beautiful way of framing this. And a very kind of specific question is, for those, right, who haven't read the book a little bit, could you actually kind of walk us a little bit, not necessarily sort of chapter by chapter, but I guess a little bit chapter by chapter, if you can talk to us about the sets of musicians that get brought up in each chapter, so that folks can, I think, really kind of gather the kind of arc and then the kind of sort of collective that you're really bringing to the fore here.
Yeah, I think so. One of the ways I try to talk about these musicians as a unity is to talk about this style history. Style history is kind of an unfashionable thing in music studies. It's associated with, classical music, romantic music, modern music, the breakdown of tonality, these sort of traditional progressions of musical style that seem to operate. One of the reasons it's critiqued is that it's often considered to be separate from social history. And I think one of the things I was interested in this book is to revisit style history, because I think a concern I had started to emerge is that a lot of what falls in the world of music history or musicology still assumes a kind of backdrop of white European style histories, and that they're doing maybe contextual work or finding forgotten figures, but there's still this sense that like there's a backbone, could be in a music history survey or something like that, that is a largely white and European meta-narrative. And in order to sort of talk about the 1960s in relationship to that meta-narrative, I wanted to foreground, essentially, to go back to this question of technology, media, television, multi-track recording, radio, that these technologies put style history off in all of these other dimensions. They brought in all kinds of oral traditions, and they fundamentally changed, like, I think, how musicians thought about themselves as making music. And Bob Dylan famously says, he's listening to country music on the radio. I listened to this music on the radio in Hibbing, Minnesota, and I felt like I could be somebody else. And so it's like, okay. And then he's reading Rimbaud, who says, I is another, and talking about this bohemian fantasy of leaving your race, your gender behind, or blurring it, or becoming somebody else while you're singing, and kind of, getting into this complicated question of mimesis, or inhabiting the other and mimicking the other, and hipsterism, and all of the social ideologies at this moment. I think when music has a whole new set of technologies, this social question of self-transformation that is alchemical becomes part of the change in style histories. So it's inseparable from that. And so the book very much foregrounds that kind of like that rupture and sort of the fantasy of transposition and transformation that music seemed to provide for people in the 1960s and 70s at a new scale. It's not like it wasn't present before, but it was just accessible to a new level, and musicians could learn music, just by imitating what they heard on records. And of course, bebop famously was doing that in the 1940s. But again, it's a question of sort of the accessibility and the ubiquity of it. So one of the ways I think about all of these different musicians is I sort of talk about these different concepts. One is atmosphere, one is hyperfracture, and one is alchemy. And I use these concepts to talk about this transformation. And one of the things that, you know, atmosphere in the simplest sense is that feeling of transformation, like the music is seeping into you and you feel like something has blown open, and it's like a revelation of a different kind of being. Hyperfracture is, Ornette Coleman and David Tudor fit into this, where they're interested in notation, but it gets so complex that it turns into a kind of, you know, you're not even sure what counts as a musical note anymore. You're not sure what counts as a kind of musical object. And so a certain kind of confusion and complexity begins to proliferate. And then beyond that is this idea of alchemy. I think, you know, for me, Alice Coltrane is very much pushing bebop into the terrain of alchemy. Certainly Miles Davis is pushing, you know, modal jazz into the direction of alchemy. The Velvet Underground is deeply interested in alchemy, influenced by Phil Spector and Indian music and doo-wop. The punk musicians, Patti Smith and Richard Hell, that I write about, they're poets, but they love this idea that like music can actually transform the substance of reading poetry into something that really takes you somewhere else, right? And for them, that's, you know, Blackness is wrapped up in that fantasy. And Richard Hell talks about imagining himself as a kind of, you know, as a Black preacher, and you know, being able to sort of harness the kind of metaphysical energy of you know, Protestant Christianity, right, in this ecstatic mode. And so for me, one of the things that one of the ways to talk about these various approaches to the avant-garde is to think about how musical substance is there. People are experimenting it in a way that causes you to question, like, do I even know what I'm hearing? Or am I becoming something entirely separate from who I thought I was as a listener, as a musician? And so for me, I think it's not in terms of style history that like, oh, there's new musical materials available to people, although that is partly what's going on. It's also a question of how the self relates to that music and a kind of infusion of transformational energy that this music creates in listeners. Hence the question of like critics saying this music is psychosis, this music is nihilism, I'm not sure what I'm hearing anymore. So that's a kind of one of the backdrops of like thinking about how these musicians link up with one another.
Yeah, that's really sort of beautiful. And in fact, I mean, this notion of you know, sort of do I even know what I'm hearing makes me go to, I think, a follow-up question is, right, as you're listening to this music, right, you bring together so many different sets of musicians, and I've talked to you about this a number of different times, right? But this is not an easy task, right? To talk about Cage and Coleman and Tudor and you know, Alice Coltrane. These are folks that's like, you know, to kind of write about them in the way that you do is so beautiful, but I can also imagine it had to be so challenging. And so I think one of my questions is to really kind of, if you could help us talk us through the process of actually writing about this music that, again, you've already mentioned. Part of that is, do I even know what I'm listening to? Can I even articulate the things that I'm hearing? And yet you're able to do that in the book. So if you could talk to us about that particular kind of writing process, because I think I struggled with that as well in my own book, and talking about, as we already talked about, Miles Davis and really things like sort of On the Corner in that 1970s period
Yeah.
was a particular kind of challenge there.
Yeah, I say, so one thing I failed to mention that I need to say is that one thing that made it much easier to select these figures is that they all try to act as philosophers in some way or another. Like they're all kind of interested in it. I don't have to like do the work. You know, I'm talking about interviews. Like there's a whole apparatus of like interviews, liner notes, you know, spiritual diaries, other kinds of memoirs or writings, literature that people write, you know, and some of it's not super extent or archival materials related to their process. So some of it's not super extensive, but, you know, in thinking about how musicians, you know, work as philosophers, I wasn't going to be able to simply turn on a record and like, you know, retroactively understand how someone, when they put this complicated record together, they were doing philosophy, right? I needed the help of the liner notes, right? And I certainly, for Alice Coltrane's work, you know, the liner notes, I think, are part of the project, right? I think, and interviews, I mean, Ornette Coleman, you know, he's one of the great people to ever be interviewed. You know, I think in the way he sort of leads people down the trail of like, this is what harmolodics is. And then he never quite gives you the answer, and he sort of moves it around, keeps this kind of mobility going. I mean, that's an incredible way to sort of show people the ineffability of music, right? To sort of, you have some really nerdy interviewer who wants to figure out, they'll tell me how harmolodics works, give me all the rules. And he's like, well, you know, and he's like giving you enough to go on, but never really arriving at it, right? And in fact, Lou Reed kind of does a similar thing with the Velvet Underground. I think he's borrowing from Bob Dylan, who's also influenced by Warhol. So I think there's a kind of, like a kind of, especially for Warhol, a queer aesthetic of coolness and withholding that is a strategic choice. And so all these thinkers, or all these musicians, when they do their thinking and philosophy, you know, there are just historical sources that are really fun to read that allow you to kind of think about, okay, how are they thinking about something like atmosphere and alchemy and hyperfracture? How are they reflecting on the powers of musical sound? Because every one of them is trying to do philosophy, right? They don't write scholarly articles. They don't publish a whole book. Although Ornette Coleman said, you know, maybe one day I'll write that book on harmolodics. He never wrote it, right? So they never do the professional philosophy thing. And they don't want to, right? Because they want to sort of do it in a more strategic and oblique way. So every one of them was lended themselves to like, you know, this kind of reconstruction that I got to do, which is like taking all the historic, like getting some context in the background, finding some recordings that are really interesting, pulling together interviews, other kinds of sources to kind of create a portrait of how the philosophical thinking that they're doing as they are experimenting, like in their choices, right? So that was a big thing in terms of, you know, what lent themselves to inclusion in this book.
No, and like I said, it made me, and we talked a little bit about this, right? It also kind of made me think of how I was thinking about sort of my own listening practices and writing practices in terms of the book that I was writing as well, right? As you kind of mentioned, right? There's a way that the way in which we're kind of approaching sort of these sets of musics is somewhat similar, right? We have a different kind of style and different sets of artists, but there are particular kind of ways in which we're drawing on something similar, right? So even in the Miles Davis chapter, right, part of what I'm also trying to do in that particular chapter in my book is to draw not only on printed interviews, but again, the sets of interviews that I'm doing with folks who also worked with Miles Davis to kind of fill out some of those things, right? I have my own kind of approach to how I think about On the Corner, but I'm also really open and I was very inviting for folks to kind of challenge that, right? I didn't go into that chapter thinking this is what I'm going to write about, but rather, right, I allowed the stuff that was coming through in the archive, the stuff that was coming through in my own sets of interviews to lead me through my own analysis of that particular album and really of that year, because I'm focused really on that year of 1972 in Miles Davis's life.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I was rereading your Davis chapter. I realized that, saying this to Elliott earlier, you know, we have a similar kind of way of approaching musical recordings, where it's like talking about like these key decisions we feel like are being made, right, in the music, and sort of a few salient details. And your approach, I was, you know, we were talking about this idea that, you know, the kind of the nexus of Afro-Asian collaboration has utopian potentialities in your interpretations. And it doesn't like Davis is not going to say like, this is what I'm trying to do, right? So it's like he's going to be saying other things, right? But then like all of that other historical context and source work and everything, and then the hermeneutic work allow you to flesh out like, how is it that this album and this aesthetic object does have such utopian power in terms of Afro-Asian collaboration, of thinking about the complexity of coalitions or you know, the politics of the street corner, like how all of that can be layered into the music itself is this like dialectical thing where you really have to sort of deepen the context, right, in order to hear that beyond just like what Davis himself is dealing with. And I think I was wrestling with parallel questions in my book in terms of like, if you're going to do, you know, if you're going to sort of link these albums to, you know, deeper historical imaginary, that, you know, the kinds of historical perspectives that can animate those choices and your interpretation of those choices, there's a multitude, right? Particularly in the 1960s, where, you know, we do have pretty big archives of a lot of these styles. And we can look at a lot of newspapers and reception history and that kind of thing. So it was helpful to see you working, you know, in that kind of mode.
Yeah, and it was just it was also like, for me at least, as a reader of your book, helpful to get me to kind of think about how I understand, you know, sort of other sets of, you know, sort of artists and their musicianship, and in particular is really the work around Alice Coltrane, and I think that, you know, sort of the Coltrane chapter that you have is really brilliant and really smart. And I want to know if you can talk a little bit about what you're doing in that chapter, what you're thinking about in that particular chapter, because, you know, as you know, as I know as well, right? You know, sort of Alice Coltrane, I think more often than not, right, will get a kind of nod here and there, but a particular kind of sort of fleshing out isn't as common within, I think, an academic writing as perhaps it should be, right? And I'm saying this as someone in my own book, right, that my Coltrane chapter is focused primarily on John Coltrane. I talk a little bit about Alice Coltrane at the end of that chapter. Right, but you kind of take Alice Coltrane, I think, sort of head on in this really powerful way, and thinking about the role of the avant-garde, thinking about the role of sort of, again, to the musician as philosopher, the question of the ineffable, right? So if you can briefly, I think, talk to us a little bit more about that particular chapter, because I think it works really well with the chapters that precede it, but also the chapters that come after.
Yeah, no, I think this issue of John Coltrane, like the Frankowski interview where, you know, he sort of asked him point blank, like, and this is late, it's probably 65 or something like that, you know, asking him about ineffability in music and philosophy and whether or not there's philosophy in his music. And he's just like, well, the music is enough. And he kind of defers to the music, and he's sort of like deferential. He's like, I'm not going to, you know, fully explain or unpack it. He's like, the music is complicated enough. Do we really need to add philosophy to it? And the thing about Alice Coltrane is she does add philosophy to it, and the music gets more complex, you know, because she goes into this the new terrain of studio editing and sort of you know, the tape splices and a kind of these like hallucinations and apparitions of different styles. She creates these sort of, you know, almost haunting sort of theatrical scenes in her music, simply with, you know, the Wurlitzer organ that sounds a little bit like the saxophone of her late husband. And she's sort of playing things that some critics feel are uncomfortably close to her late husband's saxophone playing. And this is a kind of reincarnation. And then she's writing in the liner notes. She's like, you know, this is a universal consciousness, right? This is a sort of struggle, right? So knowing, if you know the Bhagavad Gita or like some of the texts that were widely read, influential on her, struggle is absolutely essential to this kind of consciousness transformation. but it's of course read through the prism of 1960s universalism. And she's certainly in the liner notes, also in, you know, a few of these interviews, but in the spiritual diaries in particular, trying to think all of it together, right? Trying to understand how this a kind of alchemical imagination in sound that is, of course, indebted to gospel and bebop, and, you know, going back to her background as a Baptist organ player in a church and playing, you know, studying with Bud Powell and having, you know, kind of incredible digital facilities, sort of developing her own language at the keyboard. She wants to sort of think through and provoke her audience to understand how this can be metaphysical, how this can be political, how this can be social. And there are no one-to-one alignments, right? It's sort of like she asks her listener to be in a sort of collision with music and sound, and philosophy. And I'm aware, I know I feel like I want to make sure there's time for questions, Elliott, so I don't want to go on in too much detail, but I do feel like one of the things that had been missed, certainly in the gendered reception of Alice Coltrane as being so indebted to her late husband, that not only were the innovations diminished by certainly the jazz press and by many others, but the specifically philosophical, spiritual sort of drive of her work, I think has been a bit under-recognized. So the chapter was also trying to kind of elevate the complexity of work that she's doing there.
Oh, yes, and I'll also just kind of add, right? I think part of what you're also kind of, I think, gesturing toward is the kind of gendering that also happens when we think about even the space of philosophy, right? So like, right, there's the kind of sort of sexism and misogyny that Alice Coltrane faced as a musician, and as well as a kind of philosopher, right? That particular kind of category, that particular kind of social formation is something that she becomes sort of blocked away from, right? And so how you're kind of thinking about sort of Alice Coltrane as a philosopher and drawing out, as you mentioned, the kind of liner notes and the interviews, very clearly articulating her, very clearly articulating Alice Coltrane as a philosopher, I think is a really powerful move. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, but that's, I just wanted to give that.
No, I mean, I think, but this is precisely the issue, is like she could never have worked as a college professor in a philosophy department, you know, and she couldn't have even worked as a music professor in a department during the 60s and 70s. So she became a guru, right? I mean, she had her own ashram, and I think the questions of subjectivity and the way it's raised and gendered there is inseparable from like the platform she's trying to think through philosophically, right? It invites these really interesting questions like, is philosophy of music never supposed to be a totally academic discipline? Is it just better off in a space that is, you know, not to say like, you know, we want to naturalize someone's inability to get like a reliable income in the US, like that's hugely problematic. But to think instead about like how philosophy does sort of live and survive in spaces that, you know, aren't necessarily recognized as such. And so how can we think about that as part of the intellectual history of this music, as part of the social history of this music?
I was like, I'm trying to also be mindful of time about when to turn over to Q&A or not. I have a question that I was not prepared to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Okay, go ahead.
No, because it's coming. I wonder, Mike, if you can actually also talk to us, I think, a little bit about a difference. If you see a particular kind of difference between sort of a musician as philosopher and a musician as theorist. I know this is completely, this was not something that I was coming to kind of talk to you about, but it is something that I am now kind of pondering in my own mind, and also I think in my own work as well.
Yeah. I think the definition of philosophy is something I discussed briefly. I can't remember if it's the introduction or if it's one of the early chapters, but I think this is something that's very controversial. And it's also, you know, talking about definitions of music too can be controversial in situations where that concept doesn't totally apply very well. It's obviously a Greek word with a very powerful institutional history associated with departments that, you know, historically, you know, and continue to be overwhelmingly white and male. I teach a critical theory and social change class, and it's very important, I think, to the students and to me to talk about critical theory as a distinct tradition that certainly starts out with European leftism. But by the new left, it's already become way more complex, right? And has opened up, basically evolved in the 1960s to entail critical race theory, intersectional feminism, and neo-Marxisms of various sorts, social reproduction theory. And so when I say the word, think about the word theory, I do think about, maybe my own method is more of closer to theory, right? I talk about this idea of immanent critique. I'm very much interested in sort of problem-based history. So define a social problem, define a musical problem, connect them, and show that this is motivating what you're valuing rather than just saying, okay, well, here's a forgotten musician. No, it's like, what are those processes, right? What are the tendencies? So I think for me, I think of myself as a critical theorist by training and by disposition and by method. My historiography is materialist in that way. I am, the center of it is both musical and social concerns. Actually, Baraka's Blues People was a model for this, and thinking about, I think, he far exceeded Adorno in being able to sort of actually join social history and music history together in a single volume, right? And sort of try to treat both with equal attention. It's very tricky to actually pull that off. So I guess my own lens is that of a kind of theorist, right? That is also like the leftist bias of my work, which is a bias I'm very happy to have. Whereas the philosophy is sort of like, I don't know. I mean, philosophy is used to talk. I mean, people talk about oral philosophy. People talk about vernacular philosophies. I'm interested in the idea that, like, these narrow traditions don't get to own the term. They don't get to own the concept of wisdom. They don't get to own the concept of questioning. And so I like the idea of taking that and making it, probably for some traditional philosophers, maybe uncomfortably broad, but I actually think like that's changing too within philosophy departments. I think, the definition of what counts as philosophy is broadened. So yeah, I mean, that's one way of answering the question, right? Is like, I guess, like I see myself as being a critical theorist by disposition and method, and maybe the topics that I'm studying, I want to take that term philosophy and historically, socially stretch it as far as I think it can go.
No, that totally works for me. Like I said, it came to mind in relation to Alice Coltrane, and I was thinking about really the work of Barbara Christian and the Race for Theory, and I was thinking about how she thinks about the ways in which within sort of literature and sort of literary sets of criticism in the 1980s, that the kind of move toward theory was happening at the same time as we see more women and people of color entering the academy and studying sets of texts by women and people of color, and of course women of color and third world women, that was a particular kind of way to further alienate and marginalize and sideline a particular kind of focus. And so I'm thinking about I think Alice Coltrane as philosopher, but also Alice Coltrane as theorist, and what that actually also does. So that's where my mind was actually going in that respect. So
yeah, that's it. And bell hooks too on this question of like in teaching to transgress and theory as liberatory practice, I think has also been helpful to me on this issue in terms of affirming critical theory as wedded to social emancipation, right? It's like I can escape pain by generalizing and understanding like structure, right? And seeing and understanding, not just like, okay, coalition and solidarity, but also like complexity and impossibility and contradiction. And I think those tools have now a deep history within a lot of ethnic studies departments, a lot of American studies departments. And they're as recognizable to my students as the word philosophy at this point. And maybe it's because like critical race theory was in Fox News for so many years. And it's like, the students are aware of it, from adverse perspectives. But I do feel like there's an empowerment associated with critical theory that I always come back to as a thinker. And that is, I think I agree that it's been used to marginalize both people and the term and the method as unphilosophical, right? And I think the distinction to some of my students is kind of immaterial. Like they would use either term, but they just want to feel that there's a grip on the social problem, right? That's the thing that matters to them the most. Does it open something? Does it name something that they feel is a problem? And so that's something that is important to the way I think about this.
Great, thank you.
Are we ready to open it up for questions, do you think?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this discussion. And we have some questions in the chat, and please feel free to add more questions in the chat. And I think I might have the first question. How important is New York to your argument about the avant-garde? I was thinking of Sun Ra as an example of a musician who's self-consciously acted as a philosopher, and that Sun Ra's southernness inflected his philosophy, though he founded the orchestra in the North. So thinking about, does it happen to be situated in New York, or does the New Yorkness of the people that you're talking about materially inform the kind of avant-garde you're talking about? Or did you, would Sun Ra, who wasn't based in New York, but also was really influenced by southernness, fit within the ways you're thinking about how musician as philosopher works?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good question. And Sun Ra obviously is, fits in this milieu very well. In fact, pretty early on, like a kind of an earlier figure than some of the figures in the book. Based in Chicago, for key moments in his career. And I think about like Bill Seitz's book on Sun Ra's Chicago, the kind of work that he does, like talking about, there's a really interesting chapter about Sun Ra working in Calumet City, in the version of the culture industry, like working as a kind of pianist, and entertaining people with, who are coming out of the steel mills, right, in northern Indiana. And there's a real specificity to the whole social history of how he figures out how to improvise and how that's associated with the city in particular. So the New York element is not as strong as, to use your word, material element. I refer to it here and there. I mean, I certainly talk about geography. I talk about clubs, the political economy of the city, and the politics of uptown and downtown, and the racialization of scenes. They're points of reference, but it's not something that, I think it's something, one of those things when you're working on a project and you're drawing these case histories together, it's like, you start to see commonalities, but it didn't begin from like me trying to think about New York and who's there, right? It's sort of one of those things that came during the process of like, deep into the project and realizing, oh yeah, like there were these kind of uncanny overlaps and potential points of contact and things like that. So I think I don't have a chapter that like gets deep into that, but it's a really great question. And I know that people have done that work where they really talk about, I think my next book, I am really interested in the music industry and in political economy, and it might go more in that direction of like looking at the infrastructures that are sort of supporting some of these, the traffic of sounds and ideas and social imaginary. This book has, it sort of focuses more metaphysical and more at that level of, these, how people are talking about aesthetic and social changes intertwined. So yeah, it's a great question. And I hope to look at that more in a future project.
Thank you. I think Carl is next. Or is that a question or a comment, Carl?
That's a question. Yeah. Thanks, Antonia. Thanks for this conversation. I guess I want to push a little at this idea of alchemy. You were talking about it in the framework of these kind of avant-garde bohemian artists, talking about Dylan and talking about Patti Smith, transcending the self and looking to become the other, incorporate the other. It doesn't seem to me like we can talk about the Black avant-garde musicians in your study in those terms, and they don't conceive of transcendence in the same terms. And I'd like to hear you talk about the difference between those things and how that applies to these categories.
Yeah, so I guess I should talk a bit more about the chapters to sort of clarify some of this. So there are many, alchemy, as I describe it, is more of a formal process where sort of like the choices that are happening musically become inconsistent and layered enough that you can't really isolate what a distinct musical sound is. Now, the kinds of social fantasies that are sort of infused or layered within that kind of music are varied. So the bohemian, the sort of white hipster bohemianism thing is one framework. Michael Veal talks about another approach to alchemy in his book on dub, like talking about Lee Scratch Perry or King Tubby, where you're dealing with, you know, a sort of poesis that's basically about, you know, tinkering with technology to sort of get at, you know, it's like you're preparing a soup and trying to get the seasoning right. So this kind of like dealing with the liquid inconsistencies of mixes. And so I don't use the term alchemy to talk about Coleman or David Tudor, but I would use it to talk about, I sort of talk about Coltrane as a transitional, like there's hyperfracture elements to her work that's like indebted to bebop and this sort of digital complexity and all these trills and ornaments that are like, actually there's a lot of exactitude to, I think, the way in which she's performing. And a lot of like, you know, think all the time sort of bebop responsiveness to the way in which the improvisations are happening. But then in using those alchemical, like using the mixing technology, using the sort of studio technology, she's pushing into alchemical transformations musically. And her approach is not bohemian at all in the sense that it would be for Bob Dylan. It's about a spiritual transformation, and it's deeply bound up in race and gender and caste as well, and a sort of response to caste politics and in relating that to civil rights politics. But I think for her, it's a very distinct sort of philosophical social perspective on alchemy. So there's, I mean, yeah, this isn't meant to sort of represent a totalizing, like, this is what alchemy is. It's always about bohemianism. And so I didn't want to give that impression. I think that's just one approach that was super vivid for, you know, someone like Bob Dylan, also Lou Reed talking about listening to doo-wop on the radio. Like it was just a deeply racialized, you know, fantasy of transformation that I think pushed their experimentation.
Well, thanks.
Next up, we have Emily Pons. You had a question and you added to it. Are you able to ask the question out loud, or do you want me to read it?
Actually, there's a lot of background noise where I am, so maybe if you can read it, sorry.
No problem. Let's see. You're talking about how technology ultimately changed how musicians thought about themselves as making music. I'm wondering if this, especially with cassette tapes and loudspeakers, is also what helped Rai artists reinvent their genre, which then became modern Rai in the 1980s and 1990s, first in Algeria, then in France. And then Emily added to that, to go back to my questions, I wonder if we may add that technology leads to new listening cultures as well as new cultures of representation for performers and audiences alike. Because style history could also apply to audiences' ways of listening and audiences' ways of responding to and interacting with the music, including when it is transformed by technology.
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, the Rye example is certainly another, and there are innumerable examples. I guess it's sort of provocative to say this, but when I said like, oh, in the 60s and 70s, all these new genres were created, I actually think we're reaching a point where we're not going to have very many new musical genres anymore. I think that there may be, we're getting to a point where there's a sort of saturation. So to go talk about Rye in the 80s and 90s, I think that's very much a part of a whole set of practices that emerges in the 60s around recording and, you know, being able to respond to recordings and to learn how to play and to experiment in response to other people's recordings and to radio broadcasts and television broadcasts. And I think that so much genre multiplication and social imaginary opens up during these decades when those technologies are new and the culture industry has a certain height of its powers in terms of being able to disseminate it and sort of create kind of ideological powers around it. And I think in the age of streaming, we're now at a moment when any new music you create is going to be, the second you upload it to Spotify, here's 10, 15, 20 other things that sound just like it. And I think we're in a different kind of platform capitalism, surveillance capitalism moment about genre and ubiquity and more music than we can ever listen to. And it's like a saturation or a fog or whatever the metaphor is. And so one of the things that has become interesting about the 60s is like, I feel like now that we're no longer in a moment where people feel like there's new genres being emerging all the time, that the 60s suddenly can like appear in relief. It's like, oh, this was a moment where there was so much dynamism and it felt like new grammars were being invented year by year. So in the way that Rye is, you know, still, I think, part of that moment in terms of new genre invention, I think there's absolutely a lot that's still unfolding in terms of style history at that point.
Thank you so much.
Ted Gordon had a question, but I think he had to go, so I'll just ask it on his behalf and see what your thoughts are about it. He said, this may not be within the scope of the book, but I'm curious about your thoughts on the phenomenon of avant-garde jazz musicians such as Archie Shepp, Jackie McLean, Anthony Braxton, and many others moving to academic spaces in the 1970s, or in general, maybe the relationship between musicians/philosophers who resist institutionally and those who eventually gravitated toward it.
This is an interesting institutional and actually, you know, Antonia's sort of sociological question of like how people support themselves and like what the kinds of networks they rely on. So I'm not an expert in this, but just thinking about Braxton, Archie Shepp, I mean, there are people that find the right institutional home. But those opportunities are rare. They continue to be rare. I think for people who are not, I think, you know, for something like music composition, that is still pretty narrowly defined as a field of study that requires distinct kinds of pedigrees and trainings and sort of, you know, can they teach X or can they teach Y? These sort of, you know, interview questions that I do think filter people out. And so, there certainly, I mean, but if you compare, for example, to visual arts, you know, art departments hired many more avant-garde figures, many more experimental figures, specifically, and poetry too. I mean, thinking about literature and poetry and creative writing, I think there are certain creative arts fields that just as institutions have been better at having their doors open to certainly Afro-modernists, but not exclusively Afro-modernists, also indigenous perspectives. And I think, but part of it is like, you know, the rise since the New Left of ethnic studies, American studies, like interdisciplinary departments that were explicitly coming out of student movements and designed as homes for this kind of interdisciplinary work. I think had the unfortunate effect of, for some humanities fields and music, allowing those fields to not open up as much. So I think, you know, there's an interdependence question there, and I probably a historian of these institutions can answer it better than I. But I think there's probably a little bit too much tokenism in the way some of those hires happened, where there's not really meaningful, like, you know, Afro-modernist creative music departments being built, but there's sort of like single hires of having to exist in departments that are set up to do, you know, predominantly white modernist composition. So I think the challenges have persisted, even though we have seen, you know, some transformation.
I think that was the last question officially, but I actually had a question that I didn't put in the chat. So as you talked about the Velvet Underground and Lou Reed, and in passing you talked about the kind of withholding that came out of a queer sensibility that comes from Andy Warhol. And one of the arguments is about how avant-garde musicians are challenging race and gender. That made me think, is there something queer about the avant-garde that you're talking about? Any sort of the way that people responded with such horror to the avant-garde music, and how that's gonna lead to more mental health issues, and the way that Lou Reed was actually hospitalized, but in part because it was sexual. Like, is there a queer take to be had about this?
There's a history of institutionalized homophobia that comes up in the book. So Cage is dealing with it, Tudor is dealing with it, although Tudor's sexuality is, you know, I think it's queer, it's sort of complex, and, you know, it's not, you know, I think he and Cage maybe weren't as close as some people think they might have been. I mean, Cage was famously close with Cunningham. So there's a queer reading of Cage, which is a very persuasive and important reading, that the kind of interest in Zen and silence itself is a sort of strategic response to repression of queer sexuality. That's not exclusively, but that's just sort of one of the elements. And so there are issues like, I mean, I think the emphasis in the Cage Tudor chapter is very much on excavating, I think, some of the ways in which they're responding to Indian and Chinese philosophy in actually ways that mirror a lot of popular culture at the time. So it's often seen as being this like super, super intellectual kind of exercise, but like, you know, the way they actually did it was a kind of playful pastiche, and it looked, you know, the scores look like a Chinese restaurant menu, and there's like, I'm interested in that, and I think there are definitely queer readings that can be made of those choices in the 1950s. Warhol, so, and there are scholars that are experts on Warhol that could go deeper than this. Warhol, obviously, you know, is a kind of queer icon in many ways, both for the aesthetics and for what's going on in the factory. Is the factory a safe space? I don't think that you can call it a safe space. I think, you know, it was known to be pretty hierarchical, and in some ways sort of exploitative. So there are a lot of, you know, difficult elements to the way that space operated. It was certainly a very powerful space, and, you know, and again, quite hierarchical. I think, you know, even Lou Reed felt like he wasn't quite always like, you know, in the in crowd within the factory. I think that, you know, and then in the Velvet Underground, I think the Velvet Underground is like, there's sort of the standpoints within the band, like Mo Tucker being a female drummer, very rare at the time. But then, like, you know, setting up her drums in a way that sort of she imagined to be African, and critics are like, this is like Zulu drumming. And I think she did that to sort of separate herself from the culture industry grammar of doo-wop and popular music. And so there's a lot of primitivism that's in the Velvet Underground. a lot of fantasies of, you know, taking kind of Indian transcendence, which is also associated with a drug culture for them, and doo-wop, and a kind of Black sentimentality that I think is seen to have this kind of like transgressive appeal, and putting this together with almost like a Fluxus level of provocation that they're getting from Warhol. I'm not good enough an interpreter to unpack every dimension of that, except to say that like in the chapter, I try to just let it be that complicated, you know, to let all of those contradictions coexist, because I think that the point that I want to make is that like, this is not a decodable object. It doesn't mean you can't interpret it. It's just that like, music is this place where a lot of fantasies where what you don't want to talk about is going to be in the music. It's going to be a place where like, and I think for the Velvet Underground, the kind of darkest, like sadomasochistic provocations of sexuality that are also violent and painful, but also liberatory, they want the music to be a place where like those can come to life without you necessarily having to undergo that physically. I think, and so what that means in terms of race and gender and queerness and the erotic is something that I hope can remain sort of perplexing, you know? And it's not to say like, oh, I'm going to elevate the object above social life. It's like to think about it as embedded in all of those desires is to let it be something that has this just inconsistency to it. And it's going to have a lot of unconscious registers to it.
I appreciate your resistance to the redemptive. You don't need to redeem it. It's complicated and it doesn't need to be made less complicated or even problematic. I think Carl had a second question.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to, and you sort of touched on this in your last answer. I wanted to connect this to the popular a little bit. You know, one of the things you talked about was kind of the shock of dissonance and effect of that on audiences. But I think there's the sort of second shock moment that happens that's a little more of a reciprocal shock in some ways when some of these innovations cross over into the popular. And I'm thinking particularly of Miles and Fusion, obviously, which like became an enormous popular phenomenon, but was also a challenge for the institutionalized bebop world and for the jazz avant-garde as well to deal with, you know, the idea of sellout in this case. And you can kind of carry the way these influences have carried on through today, where you have somebody like Kamasi Washington drawing on these histories, but like partly within a hip hop context. And, you know, I would think of somebody like Moore Mother as well as like people who are challenging that separation between the avant-garde and the popular. And so I'm just curious how that fits into the framework that you're working with.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I mean, I think the avant-garde is definitely an object of popular fascination in not just the US, also in Japan and in certain areas of Latin America, lots all over Europe. And it becomes like the shock becomes something that's exciting to people and funny to people. So if you watch like John Cage on the I've Got a Secret show or John Cale doing the Satie's Vexations, these are great examples of television broadcasts of the 1950s where it is, you know, seen as being something kind of scandalous, but also exciting and funny. When you look at the reception history, to go back to this notion of psychosis, there's also things that are not so funny about the reception history, which is that I think there's a legitimate reading of the popularization of the avant-garde as a kind of crisis narrative, a crisis narrative that is about an explosion of violence that, you know, maybe we're just seeing here and there in terms of assassinations or, you know, unrest or dissent, but that the avant-garde is trying to be honest to a certain level of discontent. a certain disillusionment with the Enlightenment bourgeois subject, particularly after, a series of, fascisms and repressive norms of the 1950s. I think there's a sense that, particularly with figures like the popularity of Artaud, the popularity of Nietzsche, the importance of vitalism to sort of the African avant-garde, and the importance of existentialism just as a kind of popular philosophy. There are many places in which I think the avant-garde as a sort of elevation of dissent and the self sort of reaching out against all social norms and saying, I will not be shackled by dogma. And even if it means I have to scream and I appear psychotic. I think there's a way in which like that theme has many variations in the 1960s. And even to the point, I talk a bit about New Age spirituality in the Alice Coltrane chapter, but that's something that I'm also writing about for some future projects. And I'm really fascinated by how the way in which New Age spirituality rejects dogma of the past, espouses in some cases like certain kinds of universal political ideas, sort of civil rights causes, ecofeminism, anti-caste struggle, decolonization movements, in the global South. There's all these political motivations associated with sort of global spirituality, the idea that different faiths that might not be compatible, so we have to reconcile them. But New Age spirituality, like the avant-garde, elevates the self. And then it also dissolves the self. It also says, no, there's an underlying truth that exceeds the self. And that could be Brahman in Hinduism. It could be, a sort of a Zen silence. It could be, Jung and the collective unconscious. And we think of Jung probably more as a conservative thinker now, but, he was widely read at this period of time. He was super important for Patti Smith, these sort of gender binaries of, of the male and the female, anima animus, right? These were frameworks that were used to discuss gender. And so I think that, what the self means and in relationship to the avant-garde is what you're hearing in the avant-garde and in people's responses are also, they're inscriptions of the broader conversation. And I think the era of the 1960s is absolutely an era of crisis. I mean, it's an era of incredible social change. And, you read Marcuse's The Left and the Counter-Revolution, which comes in 1972, and he like maps this out in really interesting ways where he's just like, look, a lot of these social revolutions never really threatened the power of capitalism and monopoly capitalism. And so many institutions were poised to sort of push back and to engineer, right-wing opposition to social movements. So I think that, to go back to your question, the avant-garde is popular, is a reflection of broad social tendencies at the time that are part of an instability. And I think we've been left with that. I don't think they've ever really gone away in terms of the interest in the neo-avant-garde or experimentalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so interesting. I was glad you got to the New Age because that was part of what I was thinking about. And this question of like the avant-garde philosophical and then the pop philosophical and the commodification of these things and the way these things mirror each other, and like the modern wellness movement and its relationship to something like what Alice Coltrane would have been thinking about at the time. That's all really interesting stuff. So yeah, thanks.
I think, and I think the complex, we talk about the inexhaustibility of the 1960s, but I think it is good to map out these tendencies. I mean, I think because they help us sort of grasp this period. I mean, thinking about consciousness raising, new religious movements, these things are deeply informing one another, the rise of mental health sciences. I think in many ways, I would agree. I mean, I think the New Age was an avant-garde. I think a voluntary community is a kind of experimental social practice. And and the sort of perspectival kind of and utopian aspirations of new religious movements, Swami Satchidananda saying the guru is within, and sort of imagining it not as a kind of traditional like Hindu, you should be a warrior and like understand some sort of like deeper truth. No, it's like a kind of way of life and a sort of wellness regime, and like don't drink too much caffeine and abstain from alcohol. And like, I think these are, in a ways, I think these experimental practices that are circulating in the popular sphere, as you note, I think are being, again, to use that metaphor, sort of transcribed into the reception of these avant-gardes. They're mirroring one another. I mean, my favorite example is that Velvet Underground, Warhol engineers, he's like, well, you're going to play for this psychiatric conference for an audience of psychiatrists, right? And of course, they flee to the doors, right? But that itself is a kind of performance art choice of Warhol's, right? To sort of invade this academic space with this like really irritatingly loud band. And then you get all these funny headlines that sort of talk about how they couldn't tolerate the kind of insanity of the music that they heard. And it's, I mean, I do think that mirrors social tendencies.
Thank you so much. I think those are all of our questions for right now. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording, I believe.